The rain in Seattle has a way of blurring the edges of the world, turning the vibrant greens of Queen Anne into a smear of charcoal and slate. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my study, watching the mist roll in over the Puget Sound, feeling the weight of the silence in this house. It was my 62nd birthday, a day that should have felt like a milestone of a life well lived, of blueprints turned into steel and glass, of a career as an architect where I mastered the art of making things stand tall. But as I touched the cold glass, all I felt was the structural fatigue of my own soul. Arthur has been gone for 3 years now, and without him the blueprints of my life seemed to have lost their scale. Then there was the knock on the door. It was Madison, my only daughter, my masterpiece. She walked in with that brisk corporate energy that always made me feel a little bit like an outdated model. Behind her was Julian, her husband, with that polished, silver-tongued smile that never quite reached his eyes. They weren't empty-handed. Madison held a box wrapped in silver paper, tied with a ribbon the color of a bruise. She kissed my cheek, a fleeting touch of cold skin, and told me happy birthday, Mum. She said they had found something special, something that suited the woman I used to be. I opened the box, and there it was. The dress. It was emerald silk, so deep and rich it looked like it had been spun from the moss of a rainforest. The fabric felt like liquid against my fingertips, a cool, shimmering river of luxury. Madison told me it was a limited piece from a boutique downtown, something to remind the world that Clara Huntington was still the queen of the Seattle skyline. I remember the way Julian looked at me then, a sharp, calculating glance that I mistook for admiration. He said, "You deserve to look your best tonight, Clara. Everyone who is anyone will be at the restaurant." I felt a surge of warmth, a rare spark of maternal pride. I thought they finally saw me. I thought the distance that had been growing between us, the missed calls and the hurried dinners, was finally closing. I spent an hour getting ready. I put on the pearls Arthur gave me for our 30th anniversary. I brushed my hair until the grey looked like silver threads. And then I stepped into the dress. It clung to me in a way that felt like a second skin, but tighter. As I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a grieving widow or a retired architect. I saw a woman of substance. I saw a mother who was loved. I didn't notice the way the silk seemed to constrict my chest, or how the emerald hue made my skin look slightly paler than usual. I was blinded by the light of my own hope. We arrived at the restaurant, a glass-walled cathedral of fine dining overlooking the dark waters of the bay. My friends were already there. Eleanor, Beatrice, and Margaret. Women I had known since our children were in diapers. Women who had shared my triumphs and my losses. As I walked toward the table, the emerald silk rustling softly, I felt the eyes of the room on me. I felt powerful. I felt seen. Madison took her place at the head of the table, Julian to her right, and for a moment, the world felt balanced again. We ordered expensive wine, and the conversation flowed like the tide. We talked about the old days, about the projects I had built, about the future Madison was carving for herself in the tech world. But then, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first. A whisper at the next table, a lingering look from the waiter. I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck. Beatrice reached for her wine glass, but her eyes were fixed on my neck. She asked me, "Clara, that is a beautiful dress, but is that a stain on the collar?" I reached up, my fingers trembling, and felt nothing but the smooth silk. But then Eleanor leaned in, her face twisted in a mask of concerned pity. She said, "Oh dear, Clara, I think there is something caught in the lace." I looked down, and my heart stopped. Tucked into the folds of the emerald silk right against my heart, was a glimmer of something that didn't belong to me. A diamond brooch. It was a sunburst of stones, brilliant and unmistakable. I recognized it instantly. It belonged to Mrs. Sterling, the matriarch of one of Seattle's oldest families, who was sitting just 3 tables away. My breath hitched. How could it be there? I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a burning wave of confusion. I tried to pull it out, but my fingers were clumsy, tangled in the very silk Madison had given me. Before I could speak, before I could explain, Julian stood up. His voice wasn't quiet. It was projected, the voice of a man accustomed to leading meetings. But now it was laced with a performative horror. He said, "Clara, what is that? Is that Mrs. Sterling's brooch?" The restaurant went silent. The clinking of silverware died a sudden death. All eyes were on me. I looked at Madison, expecting her to laugh, to tell them it was a joke, to stand up and shield me with her strength. But she didn't. She looked at me with a cold, detached disappointment that felt like a physical blow. Madison didn't raise her voice. She used that soft, trembling tone she used when she wanted to appear like the victim of a great burden. She said, "Mum, oh no, not again. We talked about this. We talked about the forgetfulness. We talked about the things you've been taking from the shops lately." Julian reached across the table and placed a firm hand on my arm, the emerald silk bunching under his grip. He said to the room, to our friends, to the strangers watching with hungry eyes, "Please, everyone, excuse my mother-in-law. She hasn't been herself lately. The doctors call it a cognitive decline. She doesn't even know what she's doing." The words felt like stones being piled onto my chest. Cognitive decline, forgetfulness, taking things. It was a script, a perfectly rehearsed play, and I was the lead actress who hadn't been given her lines. I looked at Eleanor, at Beatrice, at Margaret. I saw the pity. I saw the way they pulled their handbags a little closer to their bodies. I saw the bridge of 40 years of friendship burning down in a matter of seconds. I tried to stand, to find my voice, to tell them that I was a Huntington, that I built the very buildings they lived in, that I would never, ever steal. But my throat was dry, and the emerald silk felt like it was choking me. Julian was already calling for the manager. He was apologizing, offering to pay for the inconvenience, acting the part of the noble, suffering son-in-law. Madison was weeping softly into her linen napkin, her shoulders shaking with a calculated grief. She whispered, "I just wanted her to have one nice night, one night where she felt like herself before the darkness took her completely." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw the predator behind the pearls. I saw the daughter who didn't see a mother, but a source of equity, an obstacle in the way of her startup's survival. They led me out of the restaurant like a criminal, not with handcuffs, but with those firm, patronizing grips on my elbows that were far more damaging. The Seattle rain was still falling, colder now, soaking into the emerald silk, making it heavy and dark. I stood on the sidewalk, the neon lights of the city blurring into streaks of red and blue, and I felt the ground disappear. I wasn't just Clara Huntington anymore. I was the old woman who stole. I was the mother who had lost her mind. I was a problem to be managed. As Julian pushed me into the back of their black SUV, he leaned in close to my ear. The smell of his expensive cologne was suffocating. He whispered, "Don't worry, Clara. We're going to take care of everything now. You don't have to worry about the house, or the bank accounts, or anything at all. You just need to rest. We'll tell everyone it was just a senior moment. But you and I both know you can't be trusted anymore, don't we?" He slammed the door, and the sound echoed in my skull like a gavel. Madison sat in the front seat, staring straight ahead, her face a mask of iron. She didn't look back at me, not once. I sat in the darkness of the back seat, my fingers stroking the damp emerald silk, and I realized that the dress wasn't a gift. It was a shroud. It was designed to make me stand out, to make the brooch visible, to provide the perfect stage for my public execution. My own daughter had invited my friends to watch her bury me alive. The drive back to my house in Queen Anne was a blur of rain and heartache. I looked at the back of Madison's head, the head I used to stroke when she had nightmares, the girl I had sacrificed my own career advancement for after Arthur died, so she could have the best education, the best life. I had poured my life into her foundation, thinking I was building something that would stand forever, but I had built a monster, and now that monster was turning its teeth toward me. When we reached the house, Julian didn't let me go to my room. He sat me down in the kitchen, under the bright, unforgiving LED lights. He took my phone. He took my keys. He said it was for my own safety. He said they would be staying with me for a while, to oversee my transition. Madison finally looked at me, but there was no love in her eyes, only a cold clinical assessment. She said, "Mum, it's better this way. You've worked so hard. It's time to let us handle the burden of being the Huntington head. You just stay here. Be quiet. Be the grandmother Matthew needs you to be, even if you can't remember his name half the time." I wanted to scream that I knew my grandson's name. I wanted to tell them that I had designed the very kitchen we were standing in, down to the last 16th of an inch. But the shock was too deep. The betrayal was too absolute. I felt a wave of nausea, a sudden crushing exhaustion that made my bones feel like lead. I let them lead me upstairs. I let them tuck me into bed in the room I had shared with Arthur for 30 years. As the door clicked shut, and I heard the lock turn from the outside, I lay there in the dark, still wearing the emerald silk dress. It was damp, cold, and smelled of salt and shame. I felt my spirit breaking, a slow, agonizing fracture that reached the very core of my being. I thought of the way my friends had looked at me. I thought of the whispers that would be spreading through the city by morning. I thought of the daughter I had lost. I curled into a ball, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I was 62 years old, and I was alone, truly alone. The structure of my life had collapsed, and I was trapped under the rubble of my own love. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to move. I just wanted the rain to wash me away. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness take me, feeling the emerald silk like a heavy, suffocating weight against my skin. I didn't know then that this was just the beginning of the end. I didn't know that the woman who went to sleep that night was the last version of the Clara who believed in family. But as the shadows of the room closed in, I felt the first seeds of a different kind of silence taking root in my heart. A cold, hard silence. The silence of the blueprints that had been burned, leaving only the iron will of the architect beneath. I woke up hours later, or perhaps it was days. The time had become a fluid, terrifying thing. The room was grey with the light of another overcast Seattle morning. My body felt stiff, as if I had turned to stone in my sleep. I looked down at my hands. They were pale, the veins showing through like blue rivers on a map I no longer understood. The emerald silk was wrinkled now, a ruined thing, a reminder of the night my world ended. I tried to sit up, but the weight of the humiliation felt like an actual physical force pressing down on my shoulders. I could hear voices downstairs, muffled, professional. Julian was talking to someone. I heard words like power of attorney, medical evaluation, asset management. They weren't even waiting for the body to be cold. They were carving up the Huntington estate while I was still breathing the air in the room above them. I thought of Arthur's face. I thought of the way he used to tell me that I was the strongest person he knew. But I didn't feel strong. I felt like a ghost wearing a green dress, haunted by the living. I reached for the water glass on my nightstand, but my hand shook so violently that the glass shattered against the hardwood floor. The sound was like a gunshot. I stared at the shards, at the water soaking into the wood, and I didn't move. I didn't care. Let the house rot. Let the silk stain. Let the Huntington name be dragged through the mud. If my own blood could do this to me, then what was the point of anything? I sank back into the pillows, the tears finally coming, hot and bitter, washing away the last remnants of the woman who thought she was a queen. I was Clara Huntington, the architect who built a life on a foundation of lies. And now I was finally seeing the cracks for what they really were. The emerald silk felt like a snake coiling around me, and in the silence of my room, I realized that the only thing more dangerous than an enemy you know is a daughter you thought you loved. The perfume of the night before, a scent Madison had chosen for me, still lingered on the fabric. It was jasmine and sandalwood, but now it smelled like rot. It smelled like the end of the world. I lay there, listening to the rain tap against the window, a relentless, rhythmic accusation. I was 62, and I was broken. The architect had failed, the structure was down, and as the darkness of depression began to pull me into its deep, suffocating embrace, I wondered if I would ever have the strength to look at a blueprint again. I didn't know how I was going to survive the next hour, let alone the rest of my life. The shame was a living thing, eating me from the inside out. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Sterling's shocked face. I heard Madison's trembling, false voice. I felt the emerald silk. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making, a victim of my own capacity for trust. And as I drifted back into a fitful, trauma-filled sleep, I realized that the hardest thing about betrayal isn't the act itself. It's the realization that the person you would have died for is the person who held the knife. Part 1 ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating sound of a heart finally giving up. The silence of the house had a physical weight to it, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb every sound of my existence. I sat in the armchair by the window in my bedroom, the same place I had watched the sunrise with Arthur for decades. But now the view was obscured by the heavy velvet curtains Madison had installed while I slept. She said the light was too harsh for my delicate state. She said the doctors recommended a sensory-neutral environment to help stabilize my wandering mind. But I knew the truth. They weren't protecting my eyes. They were erasing the world. I was still wearing the emerald silk dress on that first day, or maybe it was the second. Time had become a thick, grey slurry, oozing past without markers. The silk was no longer a river of luxury. It was a cold, wrinkled husk, smelling of the wine I had spilled and the salt of the tears I couldn't stop. I felt like a specimen in a jar, a once vibrant creature pinned to a board for observation. Downstairs, I could hear the rhythmic clicking of Madison's heels and the low, muffled drone of Julian's voice. They were the masters of the house now. I was just the inhabitant of the attic of my own life. Julian came in around noon. He carried a tray with a bowl of greyish oatmeal and a small white paper cup. He didn't look at me as he set it on the nightstand. He looked at the room, his eyes scanning for any sign of rebellion, any crack in the silence he had constructed. He said, "You need to eat, Clara. We have the specialists coming on Thursday to discuss the permanent arrangements. Madison is very upset, you know. She had to take a leave of absence from the firm to manage the fallout from the restaurant. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done to her reputation? I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. I managed to whisper, "I didn't steal it, Julian. You know I didn't." He finally looked at me, a sharp, pitying smile curling his lip. He said, "The evidence says otherwise, Clara. The video from the restaurant, the brooch in your lace, the history of your little episodes. We're just trying to keep you out of jail. If we can prove you're incompetent, the Sterlings might agree not to press charges. We're doing this for you." He pushed the small paper cup toward me. "Take your vitamins," he said. "It'll help with the anxiety." I looked at the little blue pill. I didn't remember being prescribed anything for anxiety. I didn't remember seeing a doctor, but the fog in my head was so thick that I couldn't find the strength to argue. I took the pill. I swallowed the dry oatmeal, and within an hour, the edges of the room began to melt. The patterns on the wallpaper seemed to move, shifting like snakes in the tall grass. The shadows in the corner grew longer, reaching out with dark, spindly fingers. I felt my grip on reality slipping, a slow-motion fall into a well of soft, grey wool. This became the rhythm of my days. Darkness, oatmeal, the blue pill, the muffled voices from below. Madison would come in sometimes, usually in the evening when the shadows were at their most aggressive. She would sit on the edge of the bed and stroke my hair, but her touch felt like ice. She would talk to me about my bank accounts, about the trust funds Arthur had set up, about the deeds to the properties in Bellevue and the vacation home in the San Juans. She said, "It's all too much for you now, Mum. Let me take the burden. Sign the papers so I can protect what's left of the Huntington name before the creditors and the lawyers take it all." I looked at my daughter, the little girl I used to take to the park, the one who used to draw buildings on the back of my old blueprints with crayons. I looked for a flicker of the child I loved, a spark of the woman I thought I had raised. But there was nothing but a cold, hard ambition. She was an architect too, in her own way. She was designing my disappearance. She was building a future where I was just a ghost, haunting the margins of her success. I wanted to tell her that I saw through it. I wanted to scream that Julian was the one who put the brooch in my dress. I remembered a moment, a split second in the restaurant before the wine was poured, when he had leaned over to adjust my collar. His hand had lingered just a beat too long against my chest. But when I tried to form the words, they came out as a jumbled mess. My tongue felt heavy, and the blue pill made the air feel like water. I would stammer, and Madison would sigh, that performative, exhausted sigh that signaled her saintly patience. She would say, "See, you're confused again. You're making up stories. It's the decline, Mum. It's part of the process. Just sign the papers and go back to sleep. Everything will be fine." I began to live in the past because the present was too painful to inhabit. I remembered the day Arthur died. It was a rainy Tuesday, much like every other day in this city. He had been in the garden, planting the winter kale, and he just stopped. I found him there, his face pressed against the dark earth, his hand still clutching a trowel. The grief had been a structural failure, a collapse of the central support of my life. Madison had been so supportive then. She had moved in. She had handled the funeral. She had helped me navigate the maze of probate. I thought it was love. Now, through the fog of the blue pills and the velvet curtains, I realized it was an acquisition. She had been surveying the land, waiting for the right moment to build her own empire on the ruins of mine. The depression was a physical ache, It felt like my blood had been replaced with lead. I stopped bathing. I stopped looking in the mirror. What was the point? The woman in the mirror was a thief, a mad woman, a burden. I lay in bed for hours, watching the dust motes dance in the sliver of light that escaped the heavy curtains. I thought of my friends, Eleanor, Beatrice, Margaret. I wondered if they talked about me over lunch. I wondered if they had already deleted my number from their phones. The thought of them seeing me like this, a broken, medicated shell in a stained green dress, was more than I could bear. Julian and Madison began to bring strangers into the room, men in suits with clipboards, women with stethoscopes and cold, clinical eyes. They would ask me questions I couldn't answer. What is the date, Clara? Who is the president? Can you draw a clock for us? I would try. I would really try. But the numbers would run away from me, sliding off the edge of the page like raindrops on a windshield. I would see Julian nodding in the background, a look of profound, staged sorrow on his face. He would whisper to the evaluators, "She was such a brilliant woman once. It's heartbreaking to see her like this." They were building a case, a legal, airtight structure that would seal me away forever. Every missed question was a brick. Every blue pill was the mortar. And Madison was the foreman, overseeing the construction of my tomb. I felt the last of my autonomy being stripped away, like the finish being sanded off an old piece of furniture. I was being prepared for the warehouse. The worst part was the gaslighting. It wasn't just the words. It was the environment. I would leave my glasses on the nightstand, and 10 minutes later they would be on the floor across the room. I would ask for the time, and Julian would show me his watch, but the hands would be set to 3 hours earlier than I knew it was. I would hear a baby crying in the hallway, the sound of my grandson Matthew. But when I opened the door, the hallway would be empty and dark. Madison would say, "Matthew isn't here, Mum. He's at preschool. You must be hearing things." But I knew the smell of his baby shampoo. I knew the sound of his laughter. They were using my love for him as a tool to break my mind. I started to believe them. That was the deepest part of the well. I started to think that maybe I had stolen the brooch. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe my brain was a house with dry rot, crumbling from the inside out, and Madison and Julian were the only ones brave enough to stay and manage the wreckage. I felt a profound sense of shame, a crushing guilt for being such a burden to my only child. I would apologize to her when she brought me my dinner. I would tell her I was sorry for being so difficult. She would just pat my hand and say, "It's okay, Mum. We're here now. We're in control." I became a ghost in the house I had built. I knew every joist, every beam, every secret corner of this place. I had chosen the marble for the counters and the grain of the oak for the floors. But now, the house felt foreign. It felt like it was rejecting me. The walls seemed to vibrate with the tension of the lies being told within them. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain, feeling the emerald silk of the dress I refused to take off. It was the only thing I had left that was mine, even if it was a symbol of my downfall. It was a part of the night it all went wrong, a piece of the wreckage I clung to as I floated in the dark. I thought of the ocean. The Puget Sound was just a few miles away, cold and deep and indifferent. I wondered if it would be easier to just walk into the water and let the tide take me. I wondered if anyone would notice if Clara Huntington just disappeared into the mist. Madison would probably hold a beautiful memorial service. She would speak about my legacy as an architect, about my contributions to the city, about the tragic decline of my final years. She would look beautiful in black. Julian would stand by her side, the loyal son-in-law, and they would inherit the house, the money, the life I had built. The thought should have made me angry, but I was too tired for anger. Anger requires a foundation, and mine had been demolished. I was just a pile of rubble. I was the structural fatigue Arthur had warned me about in our early days of building. Sometimes he would say, "You have to know when a structure is beyond repair, Clara. Sometimes the best thing you can do is tear it down and start over." But how do you start over when the architect is the one being demolished? I lay there, the blue pill finally taking hold, the grey wool closing in. The silence of the house was absolute. I was in the silent room, the place where they put the things they no longer wanted to see. I was a secret. I was a shadow. I was a mother who had been replaced by an asset. As the darkness took me once again, I felt a single tear roll down my cheek, soaking into the emerald silk. It was a tiny, insignificant drop in an ocean of grief. I was Clara Huntington, and I was finally, completely alone. The next morning, the fog was even thicker. I could hear them talking in the study directly below my bedroom. It was my study, the place where my drawing table stood, the place where I had designed the Vance building and the Mercer Library. I heard the rustle of blueprints. I heard Julian say, "We can subdivide the Queen Anne lot. The house is old, but the land is worth millions," Madison replied. "But we have to wait for the final guardianship order. We can't move the assets until the judge signs off on the permanent incapacity." Julian laughed, a dry, metallic sound. He said, "With the medical reports we've gathered, she'll be lucky if they let her keep her own shoes." Permanent incapacity. The words echoed in my mind, a death sentence for my soul. They weren't just taking my money, they were taking my identity. They were going to have a court of law declare that I was no longer a person. I was a ward, a thing, a project. I felt a cold shiver of terror, a spark of something that wasn't quite anger, but a primal instinct for survival. It was a tiny, flickering flame in the vast, damp darkness of my mind. I sat up in bed, my head spinning. I looked at the shards of the glass on the floor, still there from the night before. They hadn't cleaned it up. They didn't care if I cut my feet. They probably hoped I would. It would be just another sign of my decline, another incident to add to the file. I looked at the door. I knew it was locked. I knew my phone was gone. I knew the world outside was convinced I was a thief and a madwoman. I felt the weight of the emerald silk against my skin. It was dirty now, stained with oatmeal and sweat and tears. It was a ruined thing, much like me. But as I touched the fabric, I felt the diamond brooch again. They had taken it back, of course, that night at the restaurant, but the memory of it was still there. I remembered the way the pins had felt as Julian had adjusted my collar. I remembered the weight of it. I was an architect. I spent my life understanding how things fit together. I understood balance and tension. I understood the way a single point of failure could bring down a whole skyscraper. And in that moment, through the haze of the medication and the crushing weight of the depression, I realized that I was the point of failure in their plan. They needed my signature. They needed my silence. They needed me to stay in the silent room until the lawyers were finished. But as I looked at the grey light filtered through the velvet curtains, a thought began to form. It was a fragile, dangerous thing. It was a blueprint for a rebellion. If I was the architect of my own life, then I had to be the one to decide when the structure was truly beyond repair. I wasn't ready to be demolished. Not yet. The blue pill was starting to lose its grip, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, I saw a crack in the wall they had built around me. It was small, just a sliver of the world outside, but it was enough. I am Clara Huntington. I whispered to the empty room. The words were weak, barely a breath, but they were the first words I had spoken that weren't an apology. I am Clara Huntington, and I built this house. The shadows seemed to flinch at the sound of my voice. The silence felt a little less heavy. I didn't have a phone. I didn't have my keys. I didn't have my friends. But I had the iron. Arthur always said I had iron in my blood. And as I lay back down, pretending to be asleep as I heard Julian's footsteps on the stairs, I felt that iron for the first time in months. It was cold. It was hard. And it was starting to burn. The door opened, and Julian walked in, the blue pill and the grey oatmeal ready. He smiled that polished, hollow smile. He said, "Time for your vitamins, Clara. It's going to be a long day. We have the lawyers coming over to finalize the paperwork. We need you to be rested." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see a protector. I saw a target. I saw the flaw in the design. I took the pill. I swallowed the oatmeal. I closed my eyes and let the grey wool take me. But this time, I didn't fall. I waited. I waited in the dark, a silent architect in a ruined dress, starting to draw a new set of plans in the silence of my own heart. Part 2 ended not with surrender, but with the quiet, terrifying sound of a mind starting to wake up in the middle of its own nightmare. The blue pill sat on my tongue, a tiny, bitter weight that promised another 12 hours of grey wool and melting walls. Julian was standing over me, his hands on his hips, watching for the swallow. I had mastered the art of the fake gulp, a subtle contraction of the throat that I had practiced in the dark hours of the night. As soon as he turned to pick up the oatmeal tray, I tucked the pill into the deep, dry pocket between my cheek and my gum. I watched his back, the expensive fabric of his suit shimmering in the dim light of the room. He was so confident in my fragility. He was so certain that he had successfully demolished the structural integrity of my mind. When the door clicked shut and I heard the lock turn, I waited. I waited for the silence to settle, for the rhythm of the house to shift into its afternoon lull. I spat the pill into a tissue I had hidden under the mattress. It was a small, blue witness to my rebellion. I felt the fog starting to lift, the edges of the room sharpening like a photo coming into focus. For the first time in weeks, the walls stayed still. The shadows retreated to the corners where they belonged. I sat up, my head clear, the architect in me finally waking up from a long, drugged sleep. I looked at the room. It was no longer my sanctuary. It was a site survey. I began to analyze the space with the clinical detachment I used to bring to a construction zone. The velvet curtains were held by heavy iron rods. The door was solid oak, but the hinges were old. I looked at the floor, at the shards of glass I had avoided for days. I realized then that my depression had been their greatest tool. My grief had been the scaffolding they used to build my prison. But love was a variable I had removed from the equation. Madison was no longer my daughter. She was a liability. Julian was no longer family. He was a trespasser. I spent the next few hours moving with a ghost-like silence that only the truly desperate can achieve. I knew where every floorboard creaked. I knew how to breathe so the air didn't vibrate. I searched the room, looking for anything they had missed. They had taken my phone, my laptop, my car keys. They had stripped me of my digital identity. But they had forgotten about the old world. In the back of my closet, tucked inside a shoebox filled with Arthur's old letters, was a small silver transistor radio. I turned the dial, the static a comfort in the silence. I found a local news station. I heard the date. I heard the weather report. I was back in the stream of time. Then I heard them downstairs. The voices were sharper now that my ears weren't muffled by the grey wool. Julian was in the study. My study. I heard the sound of a drawer being forced open. I heard him say, "The offshore accounts are tied to her biometric data. We need her signature on the physical transfer forms before the end of the month." Madison's voice was tired, edged with a frantic energy I hadn't heard before. She said, "The investors are pulling out, Julian. The startup is a black hole. If we don't get the Huntington liquid assets by Friday, the board will call for a full audit. We'll lose the house, the firm, everything." Julian's voice was cold. "We won't lose anything, Maddie. She's already halfway to the warehouse. We just need to keep her sedated for the final evaluation. The judge likes a tidy case. A senile old woman who can't remember her own name is a very tidy case. Just stay the course." The betrayal didn't hurt this time. It felt like a cold wind blowing through a hollow building. I realized that Madison's tech firm, the one I had been so proud of, was a house of cards. She hadn't been building a future. She had been burning through a legacy. And Julian was the one holding the torch. They didn't hate me. They were just pragmatic. They were using the resources available to them. And I was the largest resource they had. I began to plan. I needed a way out, but I couldn't just run. I was a 62-year-old woman in a stained emerald dress with a record for theft and a medical file that said I was losing my mind. If I walked out the front door, they would have me back in handcuffs within an hour. I needed to be more than a victim. I needed to be an architect. I needed to build a case that was stronger than their lies. I spent the next 3 days pretending to be worse than I was. I would stammer more. I would let the oatmeal dribble down my chin. I would stare at the wall for hours when Madison came in. I watched her look at me with a mixture of guilt and relief. She wanted me to be gone so she didn't have to look at what she was doing. I gave her what she wanted. I gave her the ghost. But underneath the facade, I was working. I waited for the night. Julian stayed late at the office. I heard the front door close, the sound of his car fading into the Seattle rain. Madison was in the kitchen, the smell of burnt coffee drifting up the stairs. I knew the lock on my door. It was a simple deadbolt Arthur had installed years ago for privacy. I had a small metal nail file hidden in my jewelry box. I spent 2 hours working the mechanism, my fingers bleeding, my heart hammering against my ribs. When the bolt finally clicked back, the sound was like a symphony. I slipped out of the room, my bare feet silent on the oak floors. I didn't go for the front door. I went for the study. I needed evidence. I needed the blueprints of their betrayal. The room was a mess. My architectural drawings were scattered on the floor, some with coffee rings on them. My desk was covered in Julian's financial statements. I found a folder marked Huntington Estate. I opened it, and the world went cold. There were documents with my signature on them. Perfect forgeries. They were transfer deeds for the Bellevue property. They were letters of resignation from my board positions. There was a draft of a will that left everything to Julian Thorne in the event of Madison's death. He wasn't just planning to take my money. He was planning to take hers, too. He was the parasite that was eating the whole family. I found something else, a small black device tucked behind the books on the shelf. A listening device. They had been monitoring my room, my phone calls, my life. Every word I had spoken in my grief had been recorded and used to build the narrative of my decline. I felt a surge of cold, pragmatic fury. They had used my own house against me. I needed to contact someone outside their circle of influence. I thought of my friends, but I knew the bridge was burned. I thought of the police, but Julian had the medical reports. Then I remembered Marcus Vance. Marcus was a lion of the Seattle legal world. I had designed the Vance building for him 10 years ago. We had spent months arguing over the load-bearing walls and the height of the atrium. He was a man who respected structure. He was a man who understood that a building was only as strong as its foundation. I knew he was still practicing law, specializing in estate litigation and the protection of the elderly. He was the only person who might look at the blueprints and see the flaws. I found his old business card in the back of my desk drawer. I didn't have a phone, but I remembered the house's old landline in the basement. I had designed a small, hidden nook under the stairs for the server rack and the backup lines. Julian wouldn't think to look there. He was a man of the digital age. He wouldn't understand the power of a hardwired connection. I crawled into the basement, the air smelling of damp earth and old memories. I found the phone. My fingers were shaking so hard I could barely dial. I waited, the dial tone a thin, golden thread to the world outside. When the receptionist answered, I used my most professional voice, the one I used when I was managing a $100 million project. I said, "This is Clara Huntington. I need to speak with Marcus Vance immediately. It is a matter of structural integrity." I had to wait. The silence of the basement felt like it was closing in on me. I heard Madison moving in the kitchen above my head. I heard the rain starting to pick up again. Then Marcus's voice came on the line. It was deep, gravelly, and familiar. He said, "Clara, is that really you? I heard you were unwell." I took a deep breath. "Marcus, listen to me. I am being demolished. I need an architect who understands the law. I am being sedated and gaslit by Julian Thorne and my daughter. They have forged my signatures. They have a listening device in my room. I have the documents in my hand. I am not losing my mind, Marcus. I am losing my life." There was a long silence on the other end. I felt the sweat dripping down my back. Then he said, "Where are you?" I told him I was in the house. I told him they were keeping me locked in. He said, "Clara, I need you to be very careful. If Julian is as desperate as you say, he won't stop at gaslighting. I'm going to send a courier to the side gate of your property at midnight. He'll be wearing a yellow raincoat. You need to give him copies of everything you found. Don't try to leave. Not yet. We need the evidence to be airtight before we move." I hung up, the silver of hope finally starting to shine through the grey wool. I spent the next hour at the old copier in the basement, my heart in my throat with every flash of the light. I made copies of the forgeries, the financial statements, the draft of the new will. I tucked the originals back into the folder exactly as I had found them. I was the architect again. I was working with tolerances. I was managing the margins. I slipped back up to my room just as I heard Julian's car pull into the driveway. I locked the door from the inside with the nail file. I got back into bed. I put the emerald silk dress back on. I waited. When he came in to check on me, I was the ghost again. I stared at the ceiling. I let my hand hang limp over the edge of the bed. He looked at me for a long time, the shadow of a smile on his face. He said, "Good night, Clara. Almost there now. Just a few more days." I waited until I heard the house settle into its midnight rhythm. I crept back down to the side gate, the wet grass cold against my feet. The rain was a deluge now, the Seattle sky a heavy, dark ocean. I saw him, the yellow raincoat. He didn't say a word. I handed him the envelope. He nodded once and disappeared into the mist. I walked back to the house, the rain soaking into the emerald silk. I felt a strange sense of peace. The architect had drawn the new plans. The site was prepared. The structure was being rebuilt from the inside out. I was no longer a victim of my own grief. I was a strategist. I was a survivor. I realized then that Madison had made a fatal mistake. She had forgotten who had taught her how to draw. She had forgotten who had shown her how to look at a sight and see the hidden dangers. She had thought I was the building, something to be managed and eventually replaced. But I was the one who knew where all the bodies were buried in the foundation. I was the one who knew exactly how much pressure the Huntington name could take before it shattered. I went back to my room and lay down in the dark. I didn't take the blue pill. I didn't need it. The iron in my blood was burning hot now, a fierce, bright flame that the rain couldn't touch. I was Clara Huntington. I was 62 years old. My husband was dead. My daughter was a traitor. And my son-in-law was a parasite. But I was still the woman who built the Seattle skyline, and I was going to make sure that when this house finally fell, it fell on top of them. The pragmatism was a cold comfort, but it was enough. I didn't love them anymore. The love had been a load-bearing wall that had collapsed, and I had learned to live in the open air. I thought of Matthew, my grandson. I would save him from the wreckage. I would build him a new house, one made of truth and steel. As I drifted into a natural, drug-free sleep, I felt the emerald silk dress against my skin. It was no longer a shroud. It was a uniform. It was the color of the moss that grows on the strongest stones. It was the color of survival. I was the architect, and I was finally beginning to build. Part 3 ended with the silent, terrifying smile of a woman who had stopped being a mother and started being a hunter. The rain in Seattle was no longer an accusation. It was a rhythmic, percussive score to my transformation. I sat in my darkened room, listening to the water hit the slate roof of the house I had built. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I felt like I was being washed clean of the last remnants of a mother's blind devotion. The architect was back on the job site, and I was surveying the damage to the foundation. Love was a structurally unsound variable. I had removed it from the blueprints, leaving only the cold, hard steel of a pragmatic survival. The courier in the yellow raincoat had returned 3 nights after I sent Marcus Vance the files. This time, he didn't leave empty-handed. Tucked into a nondescript paper bag disguised as a grocery delivery for Julian was a series of small, flat boxes. Marcus had understood the assignment perfectly. He didn't just send legal advice. He sent the tools of a digital counterinsurgency, high-definition pinhole cameras, miniature recording devices, and a secure, encrypted mobile hotspot that didn't rely on the house's compromised Wi-Fi. Julian Thorne thought he was the master of the digital domain, but he was a child playing with fire compared to a woman who understood the physical geometry of a building's secrets. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-focused clarity. I didn't need the blue pills. I had adrenaline. I had purpose. I would wait until Julian left for the office and Madison was distracted by her failing startup's frantic conference calls. I moved through the house like a shadow, a silent ghost reclaiming her territory. I knew exactly where to place the cameras. I hid one in the ornate molding above the study door, angled perfectly to capture the desk where Julian forged my name. I tucked another into the vents of the kitchen, where they sat and discussed my warehousing over artisanal coffee. I wired a microphone into the base of the lamp in the living room, the very place where they had staged my mental breakdowns for the doctors and evaluators. I was the architect. I understood sightlines. I understood the way sound traveled through the ventilation ducts. I was building a digital fortress around their lies, and they had no idea they were walking into a trap of my design. Every time Madison came into my room to check on me, I gave her the same vacant stare. I let my mouth hang open just a fraction. I kept the emerald silk dress on, now so wrinkled and stained it looked like a discarded skin. She would sigh that exhausted, saintly sigh and say, "I'm so sorry you're like this, Mum." It's for the best, really. Julian has found a lovely facility in the Cascades. It has a beautiful garden. You always loved gardens. I would just nod, my mind recording the cold calculation in her voice. Gardens. She meant a graveyard for the living. I watched her through my own eyes, but also through the lens of the camera I had hidden in the teddy bear Matthew had left in my room. I was recording her guilt. I was archiving her betrayal. It was no longer an emotional wound. It was a data point. It was evidence for the structural failure of her character. The blue pills were stacking up in the tissue under my mattress. I had enough now to put an elephant to sleep. I looked at the pile of chemicals and felt a strange sense of power. They thought they were sedating a woman. They were actually fueling a hunter. The fog in my head had completely cleared, replaced by a crystalline logic. I began to track their movements with the precision of a project manager. Julian's late-night meetings weren't meetings. They were frantic sessions with a liquidator. He was trying to sell my Bellevue property under the table using the forged power of attorney. I heard him on the kitchen microphone, his voice edged with panic. He said, "I don't care about the market value, Rick. Just get me the cash. We need to clear the debt before the guardianship hearing on Tuesday. If the judge asks questions, we'll just say we're consolidating her assets for her long-term care." Madison's responses were getting shorter, sharper. The stress of the lies was starting to show in the structural integrity of her own mind. She said, "Julian, what if she wakes up? What if she has a lucid moment in front of the court-appointed evaluator?" Julian's reply made the iron in my blood burn white-hot. He said, "She won't wake up, Maddie. I'll make sure the dosage is increased on Monday night. She'll be a vegetable by the time the judge sees her. It's the kindest thing to do, really. A dignified exit. The kindest thing." I sat in my armchair, the emerald silk rustling as I leaned forward to check the encrypted tablet Marcus had smuggled in. The video feed was crystal clear. I watched Julian Thorne, the man my daughter had chosen over her own mother, calmly discussing my chemical lobotomy. I felt a surge of cold, pragmatic satisfaction. I had it. I had the intent. I had the conspiracy. I had the blueprints for their destruction. I contacted Marcus through the landline in the basement at midnight. I said, "Marcus, the load-bearing walls are starting to buckle. I have the recordings." He said, "Clara, it's enough. We have more than enough. I've filed an emergency motion to stay the guardianship hearing. I've also filed a criminal complaint for elder abuse, fraud, and attempted murder. The judge is a friend of Arthur's. He saw the files I sent him tonight." He was shaken. I felt a thin, sharp smile touch my lips. Shaken. Good. I wanted them to feel the ground shake beneath them. I said, "What happens next?" Marcus told me the plan. On Tuesday morning, the evaluator would arrive, but she wouldn't be alone. She would be accompanied by a team of officers from the King County Sheriff's Department. They would have a search warrant for the house. They would find the listening devices. They would find the forged documents. And they would find me, the woman they thought they had buried alive. "But you have to stay the course, Clara," Marcus warned. "You have to stay in that room. You have to take the pills, or pretend to, until they walk through that door. If Julian suspects anything, if he sees a change in your behavior, he might act faster than we can." I understood tolerances. I understood the importance of staying within the design parameters. I went back to my room and lay down in the emerald silk dress. I felt like an actor waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act of a long, tragic play. I listened to the rain. I listened to the silence of the house. I listened to the muffled sound of my daughter's laughter from the floor below, a sound that used to bring me joy, but now sounded like the rasp of a saw against a support beam. Sunday was the hardest day. Madison came in with Matthew, my grandson, the only person in this house who still saw me as a person. He ran to the bed and tried to climb up, but Madison pulled him back. She said, "Be careful, Matthew. Grandma isn't feeling well. She's very sick in her head. She needs quiet." Matthew looked at me with his big, brown Huntington eyes, eyes that were so much like Arthur's. He said, "But I want to show Grandma my building blocks." "Look, Grandma, I built a tower." I looked at the tower of plastic blocks. It was red and blue and yellow, wobbly but standing. I wanted to pull him to my chest. I wanted to tell him that Grandma was the best architect in the city and that she was going to build him a world where people told the truth. But I couldn't. I had to stay in character. I let my eyes stay glassy. I let my hand remain limp. I felt a piece of my heart break off and fall into the dark. But I didn't let it show. I was the architect, and I was working with a rigid set of specifications. Madison took him away, her voice soft and poisonous. "Come on, sweetie. Grandma needs to rest. We're going to find her a nice place with a big playground for you to visit." She didn't see the camera in the teddy bear's eye recording her every word. She didn't see the woman beneath the emerald silk, counting the seconds until Tuesday morning. Monday night was the final test. Julian came in with the oatmeal and the blue cup. This time, there were 3 pills. He didn't look at me. He was humming a low, tuneless song. He said, "Last night in the old house, Clara. Big day tomorrow. We're moving you to the retreat in the morning. It's got a view of the mountains. You'll love it. Just take these and get a good night's sleep." I took the cup. I tucked the pills into my cheek. I swallowed the grey sludge. I watched him leave. I heard the lock turn. Then I spat the pills out and washed my mouth with the water from the vase of dead roses Madison had forgotten to remove. I didn't sleep. I sat in the armchair and watched the rain wash over the city. I looked at the skyscrapers I had helped build, their lights twinkling in the dark like beacons. I thought of Arthur. I thought of the legacy we had tried to create. I realized that the Huntington name was never about the buildings. It was about the integrity of the people who inhabited them. And I was the only one left with any iron in my foundation. I spent the night reviewing the plan. I checked the camera feeds on the tablet one last time. I watched Julian and Madison drinking wine in the kitchen, celebrating their victory. They were talking about the vacation they would take after the guardianship was finalized. They were talking about the yacht Julian wanted to buy. They were so small, so petty, so incredibly fragile in their own arrogance. They had built their future on a foundation of sand, and they had no idea the tide was coming in. As the sun began to rise over the Cascade Mountains, turning the Seattle sky into a smear of bruised purple and cold gold, I felt a strange sense of calm. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't depressed. I was pragmatic. I was an architect at the end of a long, difficult project. I was ready to hand over the keys. I stood up and walked to the mirror. I looked at the woman in the emerald silk dress. She was thin, her skin pale, her hair a wild tangle of silver. But her eyes were clear. Her eyes were hard. She was the woman who had survived the demolition. She was the woman who was about to walk out of the rubble. I heard the first car pull into the driveway at exactly 8 o'clock, then another, then a third. I heard the doorbell ring. I heard Julian's voice, the polished, hollow tone he used for visitors. He said, "Good morning. You must be the evaluators. Please, come in. My mother-in-law is upstairs. She's had a very difficult night. She's quite sedated." I heard the footsteps on the stairs. Not the 2 people I expected, but a crowd. A heavy, purposeful march. I went to the bed and lay down, folding my hands over my chest, pulling the emerald silk around me like a shroud. I closed my eyes. I waited for the lock to turn. When the door opened, I didn't move. I heard Madison gasp. I heard Julian say, "Please be quiet. She's very fragile." Then I heard a voice I hadn't heard in years, but would know anywhere. A voice that sounded like justice. "This is the King County Sheriff's Office. We have a warrant for the arrest of Madison Huntington and Julian Thorne for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy." I opened my eyes. I didn't look at the officers. I didn't look at the cameras. I looked at Madison. I saw the moment the foundation collapsed. I saw the look of absolute soul-crushing terror as she realized that the silent room had been a recording studio. I saw Julian Thorne try to run, only to be tackled by two deputies in the hallway. I stood up from the bed. I didn't stammer. I didn't shake. I walked toward my daughter, the emerald silk rustling with every steady step. I looked her in the eye, and for the first time in months, I let her see the architect. I said, "The structure was never the problem, Madison. It was the architect you chose to trust." I walked past her out into the hallway, out into the light of my own house. I felt the air hit my face, fresh and cold and smelling of rain. I was Clara Huntington, and I had survived the demolition. The blueprints were filed. The site was cleared. And as the handcuffs clicked shut on the daughter I had once loved, I realized that the hardest part of building something that lasts isn't the steel or the glass. It's knowing when to walk away from the wreckage and start again. Part 4 ended not with a cry of pain, but with the quiet, devastating sound of the truth finally being told in the House of Lies. The Seattle sky was a bright, clear blue as the deputies led them away. I stood on the balcony of the Queen Anne house, watching the black SUVs disappear down the hill. I was 62 years old, and I was alone, but I was free. The architect was back in control of the site, and the foundation was solid. I looked down at the emerald silk dress, a ruined thing, a remnant of a past I no longer inhabited. I went inside and closed the door. The house was silent again, but this time it was a silence of my own making. It was the silence of a structure that was finally standing tall. I walked to my study and picked up a pen. I looked at a clean white sheet of paper. I thought of Matthew. I thought of the world I would build for him. I didn't start with a building. I started with a line, a straight, true line that nothing could break. I was the architect of my own life, and I was just getting started. As I sat there, the light of the morning filling the room, I realized that the greatest betrayal hadn't been Madison's. It had been my own. I had betrayed myself by believing that my value was tied to being a mother, a wife, a legacy. But as I watched the dust motes dance in the light, I knew better. I was Clara Huntington. I was a builder. And the only thing more powerful than a structure that lasts is the woman who has the courage to survive its collapse and build something even stronger from the ruins. The King County Superior Court felt like a cathedral of cold marble and unforgiving light. I stood in the hallway, the air smelling of floor wax and the nervous sweat of people whose lives were about to be dismantled by a gavel. I was wearing the emerald silk dress again. I had spent hours cleaning it, steaming out the wrinkles of my despair, and having it tailored to fit the woman I had become in the dark. It was no longer a gift from a daughter or a shroud for a victim. It was my armor. It was the color of a forest after a fire, vibrant and resilient. I looked at my reflection in the polished brass of the elevator doors, and I didn't see the ghost of Queen Anne. I saw the architect, who was about to conduct a final site inspection. Marcus Vance stood beside me, his presence a solid, load-bearing pillar. He didn't say much. He just adjusted his silver silk tie and checked his watch. He said, "Are you ready to show them the foundation, Clara?" I looked at the heavy oak doors of the courtroom and nodded. I told him, "I've been calculating the stress loads for weeks, Marcus. It's time to see where the structure snaps." We walked inside, the sound of my heels on the stone floor a steady, rhythmic declaration of my existence. The courtroom was packed. The Seattle press had caught wind of the Huntington scandal, a story of old money, tech sector desperation, and a mother's supposed descent into madness. I saw the cameras flash, a strobe light of public judgment. I saw Eleanor and Beatrice in the third row, their faces pale, their eyes darting away from mine. They were part of the audience for my execution, and now they were witnesses to my resurrection. Madison and Julian were already seated at the defense table. They looked different. The black SUVs and the firm grips of the deputies from Part 4 had stripped away their corporate polish. Julian's expensive suit was rumpled, his hair a mess of frantic fingers. Madison looked small, her face a mask of calculated grief that was starting to crack under the pressure of the reality she had designed. She looked at me, and for a split second, I saw the little girl who used to be afraid of the dark. But then the iron in my blood reminded me that she was the one who had turned out the lights. The judge, a man named Henderson, who had known Arthur for 40 years, took the bench. He looked at the room with a gaze that could cut through steel. He said, "We are here to hear the emergency motion regarding the Huntington estate and the criminal charges filed against Madison Huntington and Julian Thorne. This is a matter of profound gravity." He turned to Marcus. "Counselor, proceed." Marcus stood up, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't start with the money. He started with the architecture of a betrayal. He spoke about the way Julian Thorne had surveyed my life like a piece of distressed property. He spoke about the blue pills, the gaslighting, and the emerald dress that was meant to be my final costume. Then, he called the first witness. It was the court-appointed evaluator, a woman named Sarah Miller, who had been in the house on that Tuesday morning. She testified about the state of the Queen Anne villa. She spoke about the hidden cameras we had discovered, the ones Julian had installed to monitor me, and the ones I had installed to monitor them. She played the first recording. The courtroom went silent. It was the sound of the kitchen vents. I heard Julian's voice, clear as a bell, saying, "We just need to keep her sedated for the final evaluation." I heard Madison's reply, a whisper that felt like a razor across my throat. "Julian, what if she wakes up?" I watched the jury, or rather the legal assistants and the judge who were acting as the finders of fact, and I saw the moment the foundation collapsed. Julian put his head in his hands. Madison just stared at the table, her knuckles white. But Marcus wasn't finished. He brought out the financial blueprints. He showed the forgeries. He called a handwriting expert who explained the technical failure of the forged signatures on the property deeds. He spoke about the $3 million Julian had tried to move into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He wrote the numbers out on a large display board. $3 million. He said, "This wasn't about care, Your Honor. This was a demolition for profit." Then, it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand with a steady gait. I didn't look like a woman with cognitive decline. I looked like a woman who had designed skyscrapers. I took the oath, my voice clear and resonant. I said, "I do." Marcus walked toward me, his eyes encouraging. He asked me, "Clara, tell the court about the dress you are wearing." I touched the emerald silk. I said, "My daughter gave me this dress for my 62nd birthday. She told me it was a symbol of my status. But Julian Thorne, used it as a stage. He tucked a diamond brooch into the lace and told the world I was a thief. He used my grief for my late husband as the mortar for a prison. They fed me medications that weren't mine. They tried to erase the person I have been for 62 years so they could pay off the debts of a failing startup and a gambling addiction. Madison stood up then, her voice a shrill, desperate shriek. She yelled, "She's lying! She's manipulative! She's always been like this, controlling everything!" The judge slammed his gavel, a sound that echoed like a structural failure. He said, "Sit down, Mrs. Huntington, or you will be removed." I looked at my daughter. I said, "I am not controlling you, Madison. I am just holding you accountable to the laws of this country. You thought I was a building to be subdivided, but I am the architect, and I know exactly how much weight you can carry before you break." The cross-examination by Julian's lawyer was a desperate attempt to find a crack in my testimony. He asked me about my memory. He asked me about the night at the restaurant. He asked if I was sure I hadn't simply forgotten taking the brooch. I looked him in the eye, and I didn't blink. I said, "I have the blueprints for the Sterling estate in my office. I know exactly where the security cameras are in that restaurant because I consulted on the renovation 5 years ago. I didn't steal that brooch. I was framed by the man sitting to your left. And I have the video from the molding in my study to prove it." We played the video. It was grainy, but unmistakable. It showed Julian Thorne standing by my desk, practicing my signature over and over on a sheet of Huntington letterhead. It showed him taking the sterling brooch out of a velvet pouch and whispering to Madison, "This will be the final blow, Maddie. Once she's accused of theft, no one will believe a word she says about the money." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a grave. Julian Thorne looked like a man who had just watched his own execution. Madison was weeping now, but they weren't the crocodile tears of the restaurant. They were the tears of a predator who had been caught in her own trap. The judge didn't even need to retire to his chambers. He looked at the evidence, he looked at the recordings, and he looked at me. He said, "In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a more calculated or cruel attempt to dismantle a human being's dignity. The evidence of elder abuse, financial fraud, and criminal conspiracy is overwhelming." He turned to the bailiffs. He said, "Take Julian Thorne into custody immediately. No bail." He turned to Madison. He said, "Madison Huntington, you are a disgrace to your father's name and your mother's love. I am issuing an immediate injunction freezing all your assets. You will be taken into custody pending a formal indictment for your role in this conspiracy." The handcuffs clicked shut. The sound was the same as it had been in my kitchen, but this time the metal wasn't for me. I watched the deputies lead them away. Julian was shouting about his lawyers, about his connections, about how this was a mistake. Madison just looked back at me one last time. Her eyes were empty. There was no daughter left in there, only the wreckage of a life built on greed. I sat in the witness stand for a long time after the room cleared. The cameras were still clicking, the reporters were still whispering, but I didn't hear them. I felt a strange sense of emptiness. The purge was complete. The parasites had been removed from the structure, but the building was still standing, and it was hollow. I looked at the emerald silk dress, and I realized that the price of justice was the loss of the only family I had left. Marcus Vance came over and put a hand on my shoulder. He said, "You did it, Clara. You saved yourself. You used the law to protect the woman you are." I told him, "I didn't just save myself, Marcus. I saved the Huntington name, but the cost was $900,000 in legal fees, a shattered heart, and a daughter I will never speak to again." He nodded. He understood. He said, Sometimes you have to burn the site to clear the debris. But look at you, Clara. You're still standing. I walked out of the courtroom and into the Seattle afternoon. The rain had stopped. The sky was a bright, sharp blue that made my eyes ache. I stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching the people walk by, and I felt the weight of my freedom. It was a heavy thing, but it was mine. I wasn't Clara the thief. I wasn't Clara the mad woman. I was Clara Huntington, the architect. I thought of the vacation home in the San Juans. I thought of the Bellevue property. I thought of the money they hadn't been able to steal. It was all there. Millions of dollars. A fortune built on steel and glass. But as I looked at the city skyline, I realized that none of it mattered if I didn't have a foundation of peace. I went to a small cafe near the market. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window. I watched the ferries cross the bay, their wakes like white scars on the dark water. I thought of Matthew, my grandson. I would find a way to be in his life, away from the poison of his father and the ambition of his mother. I would build him a world where a birthday gift was just a gift, not a weapon. The purge had been clinical. It had been necessary. It had been American in its efficiency and its reliance on the truth of the record. I had used the very tools they tried to use against me, technology, law, and social status, to dismantle them. I had been the more efficient architect. But as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the street, I felt the first real sting of the trauma. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the cold reality of what had happened. My daughter had tried to kill my mind. My son-in-law had tried to steal my life. I had won the war, but the battlefield was my own soul. I touched the emerald silk of my sleeve. It was a beautiful fabric. It was strong. It was resilient, just like me. I realized then that I didn't need to be a queen or a legacy or a mother to be valuable. I just needed to be the woman who knew how to build things that lasted. I was the architect of my own recovery. I paid for my coffee and walked back to my car. I drove toward Queen Anne, toward the house I had built with Arthur. I knew I wouldn't stay there. The house was too full of ghosts, too full of the echoes of Madison's false laughter and Julian's cold calculations. I would sell it. I would subdivide the lot myself. I would use the money to build something new, something small, something solid, something that was just for me. The architect was ready for a new project. The site was cleared. The demolition was over. And as I watched the lights of the city flicker on, I knew that the next structure I built would be the most important one of all. It wouldn't be made of steel or glass. It would be made of boundaries, of law, and of the quiet, unbreakable strength of a woman who had learned to love herself more than the people who tried to destroy her. Part 5 ended not with a celebration, but with the quiet, determined breath of a survivor who was finally, truly, in charge of the blueprints. The night air was crisp, the scent of the ocean mingling with the smell of wet asphalt. I felt a surge of autonomy that was almost intoxicating. I was 62 years old, and for the first time in my life, I didn't belong to anyone but myself. Not to my husband's memory, not to my daughter's needs, not to the city's expectations. I was Clara Huntington, and I was free. The emerald silk rustled as I stepped into my car, a final shimmering note in a symphony of survival. The purge was over. The building was standing, and the architect was finally going home. The morning mist over the Puget Sound was different today. It didn't feel like a shroud or a cold hand pressing against my lungs. It felt like a clean slate. I stood on the balcony of my new apartment in West Seattle, a space of glass and industrial steel that smelled of fresh paint and possibility. I had sold the Queen Anne house. I had sold the ghosts and the echoes of a daughter's betrayal for $7,500,000. I didn't haggle over the price. I didn't care about the profit margins. I just wanted the site cleared. I wanted the ground where Julian Thorne and Madison Huntington had tried to bury me to belong to someone else. The architect had moved on to a new project, and this time, I was the only client who mattered. The legal fallout had been as clinical and efficient as a demolition crew. Marcus Vance had handled the final signatures with the grace of a man who understood that justice is a form of structural reinforcement. Madison was serving a sentence of 10 years in a state facility. Julian had been given 15. The crimes of elder abuse and financial fraud were not taken lightly in this city, and the evidence I had gathered in that emerald silk dress had been the bedrock of the prosecution's case. I had watched them being led away in the previous part, and I hadn't looked back, not even once. The iron in my blood had cooled into a steady, unbreakable resolve. I was no longer a victim seeking comfort. I was a survivor who had reclaimed her autonomy through the very laws they had tried to circumvent. I sat at my new walnut desk, looking at the bank statements. The Huntington estate was intact. The $900,000 in legal fees were a small price to pay for the return of my life. I had established the Matthew Huntington Trust, a fund of $2 million that would ensure my grandson had every opportunity in the world, provided he stayed away from the poison of his father's legacy. I had arranged for shared custody with Julian's sister, a woman who lived in a quiet town in Oregon and had no desire for the Seattle spotlight. We had reached an agreement that was practical and shielded the boy from the wreckage of his parents' choices. The law had provided the boundaries that love had failed to maintain. A scent of cedar and sea salt drifted through the open window. It triggered a memory, but for the first time in months, the memory didn't hurt. I remembered a summer 30 years ago, when Madison was a toddler, and Arthur was still building his first firm. We were on a boat near the San Juan Islands, and the world felt like it was made of gold and blue. I realized then that I could hold on to that gold without being burned by the fire that followed. The betrayal didn't erase the love I had once felt, but it had certainly changed the nature of the relationship. I had learned that blood is not a guarantee of loyalty. I had learned that a family is only as strong as the integrity of its individual members. And when the integrity fails, the structure must be abandoned for the safety of those who remain. I walked to the closet and looked at the emerald silk dress one last time. It was hanging there, perfectly cleaned and pressed, a shimmering green ghost. I had thought about burning it. I had thought about throwing it into the deep, dark waters of the bay. But as I touched the smooth fabric, I realized it was more than a reminder of a bad night. It was the skin I had shed to become the woman I was now. It was the uniform of my awakening. I folded it carefully and placed it into a box. I would donate it to a charity that helped women re-enter the workforce after domestic trauma. It was a beautiful dress, and it deserved to move on, just as I had. The silence in my new home was a luxury. It wasn't the suffocating silence of the room where I had been sedated. It was the quiet of a mind that had finally stopped apologizing for its own existence. I spent my afternoons at the Seattle Public Library, the very building I had helped design decades ago. I sat in the atrium and watched the light move across the geometry of the walls. I saw the people using the space I had created, and I felt a profound sense of purpose. My legacy wasn't Madison Huntington. My legacy was the steel and stone that gave people a place to learn and grow. I was a builder, and I was still building. I had reconnected with Beatrice and Eleanor, but the bridge was different now. We met for lunch at a small bistro, far away from the restaurant of that fateful night. They apologized, their voices full of the shame of having believed the lies of a younger generation. I accepted their apologies with a polite, pragmatic distance. I understood that they were human and that Julian's performance had been masterful. But the intimacy we once shared was gone, replaced by the cautious respect one gives to a survivor. I didn't need them to be my world anymore. I had found my own center of gravity. One evening, a letter arrived from the prison. It was from Madison. I looked at the envelope for a long time, the familiar handwriting a sharp prick against my skin. I didn't open it. I knew what it would contain. It would be a mixture of blame, desperation, and the hollow promises of a predator who had run out of prey. I walked to the kitchen and dropped the letter into the shredder. The sound of the blades was a final, mechanical closure. I didn't owe her my attention. I didn't owe her my forgiveness. I had given her a life, and she had tried to take mine. The account was closed. I felt a surge of energy, a lightness in my step that I hadn't felt since Arthur died. I began to work on a new project, a pro bono design for a shelter for elderly victims of abuse. I spent my nights at my drawing table, the blueprints of a new sanctuary taking shape under my hands. I used everything I had learned about security, sight lines, and the need for hidden strength. I was building a fortress for those who had been told they were invisible. I was using my pain as the raw material for someone else's safety. It was the most important work of my life. I thought of the woman I had been in part 2, the broken ghost who stared at velvet curtains and waited for a blue pill. That woman was dead. She had been demolished to make room for the structure that was standing now. I realized that the U-shaped journey of my soul had brought me back to the surface. But I was not the same Clara. I was stronger. I was sharper. I was entirely my own person. The trauma had been a fire that burned away the soft wood, leaving only the tempered steel. The rain started to fall again, a soft Seattle drizzle that blurred the lights of the city. I stood by the window and watched the ferries cross the water. I felt a deep, quiet peace. I was 62 years old, and my life was just beginning. I had my health, I had my fortune, and most importantly, I had my truth. I had used the law to protect my dignity and the architecture of my mind to survive the darkness. I was Clara Huntington, and I was standing tall. I picked up my phone and called the school in Oregon. I spoke to Matthew. He told me about his new friend and the tower he had built in his woodshop class. He said, "I used the techniques you told me about, Grandma. I made sure the base was wide enough to handle the weight." I smiled, the tears in my eyes a warm, healing rain. I told him, "That's right, Matthew. Always start with the foundation. If the foundation is solid, the rest of the world can shake all it wants. But you will still be there." I hung up and looked out at the city. The skyscrapers were glowing in the dark, a forest of light and achievement. I felt like one of them. I had been built to last. I had survived the earthquake of betrayal and the landslide of grief. I had cleared the site and built something new. I was the architect of my own rebirth, and the blueprints were perfect. As I prepared for bed, I realized that the greatest lesson of the emerald dress wasn't about the cruelty of others. It was about the resilience of the self. It was about the power of standing up and saying, "I am here, and I matter. I am not a legacy to be managed or a burden to be stored. I am a living, breathing woman with a voice and a will." And as I closed my eyes, I didn't see the shadows. I saw the horizon. I saw the light of a new day, and for the first time in a very long time, I was ready for it. The architect was home, and the structure was finally complete. The journey was long, and the cost was high. but the result was a life of absolute clarity. I had walked through the fire and come out with a soul made of iron. I had learned that the only person who can truly define your value is you. And as the rain tapped gently against the glass, a rhythmic, peaceful lullaby, I knew that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I was Clara Huntington, and I was free. Forgiving oneself is the final, most essential brick in the foundation of recovery after a profound betrayal. For a long time, I blamed my own heart for being too open, my own eyes for being too blind to the monster growing in my own home. I felt the shame of a mother who had failed to see the cracks in her child's character. But true light only returns when you realize that your capacity to love was never a flaw. It was a strength that others tried to weaponize. Reclaiming my narrative meant acknowledging the trauma without letting it become my identity. I have learned to embrace the scars as proof of my structural integrity, finding peace in the quiet independence of a life built on truth, law, and an unwavering belief in my own worth.